The Denver Broncos defense will have to step out without Dre'Mont Jones in the final 3 games of the season. How do the Broncos approach Dre'Mont's status ahead of NFL free agency? Plus, we take a look at defensive players who have been stepping up, some young guys to keep an eye on. Plus, Josey Jewell, Alex Singleton, are they the future at the inside linebacker position for the Denver Broncos? You get that and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, everybody? Welcome into a brand new episode, Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country who makes Locked on Broncos their first listen of the day every single day. You can get this podcast free and available everywhere you get your podcast in audio format, or whether you watch us on YouTube in video format. If you're watching on YouTube, do us a favor, hit the like button on YouTube and also comment on the video for the algorithm. Share your Broncos thoughts with other members in Broncos country. From the South Stands to the end zone, I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter from Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantly orange.com. Sayre, my friend, we're diving into Rams week. Obviously, the Rams, they lost on Monday Night Football to the Green Bay Packers, and I was watching the game. I was like, all right, hey, you know what? The Broncos actually might have a chance in this matchup. And there's so much going to be a contingent. Will Aaron Donald play on Christmas? I know that's something that you are going to break down with, obviously, the Locked on Rams host in the Crossover Thursday episode, which you can all look forward to on tomorrow's episode of the show. In the meantime, Sayre, you know me, I'm a big defensive guy. Yesterday, we focused on the Broncos' offensive line, some of the issues that they've had with protection, keeping quarterbacks upright. I want to focus on the defense because while they've had moments this season where they've struggled, they have also, I think, been such an impactful unit in the NFL. But they're going to be without a key guy for the rest of the season, and that is Dre'Mont Jones, who's also in line to become a free agent.
Right. It kind of complicates Dre'Mont Jones' situation a little bit, doesn't it? As he's entering an offseason where he's going to be going into free agency. Now you start to talk about, okay, well, you finished this season on injury reserve. You got the hip thing going on. How does that affect potentially? Will the Broncos be willing to pony up the cash to franchise tag him? Or would they even want to do that in terms of the cap situation and things like that? So there's a lot going on there. Obviously, he kind of sought out a few different opinions on this to make sure that this was the right call. And I think he did put together enough, Cody, over the course of this season, over the course of his 4 years in Denver. I feel like he put together enough. I know I can't remember a specific time hearing George Paton say this, but you know how George Paton likes to call certain guys core guys or core players or whatever. I can't remember specifically hearing that about Dre'Mont Jones, although I do feel that's the sentiment. In my opinion, I feel like you traded Bradley Chubb because you intend on making a long-term offer to Dre'Mont Jones. Now, whether he accepts that or not remains to be seen. I think what a lot of guys are finding, Dre'Mont Jones is not about to take a hometown discount. I think a lot of people are kind of freaking out about that right now, nor should he, right? I mean, you really get one, maybe 2 shots at a big-time contract in the NFL if you're like elite of the elite. He's got one big shot here at a big-time contract. I think he's wise to go out and say, okay, either franchise tag me and give me whatever, upwards of $20 million guaranteed, or make me a really solid long-term offer that's going to be competitive in this market. Because I think if he hits free agency, Cody, he would be one of the most coveted free agents out there. So Dre'Mont Jones, I don't think the injury affects his free agency pursuits. I think he's done enough to be one of the most coveted, highly sought after guys on this year's market, regardless of position.
No, I mean, you are spot on there, and here's why. Like, in 13 games, look, Dre'Mont has been battling through a lot of injuries this year, but he's played through them, right? But he suffered a fractured hip, and the Broncos lost against the Kansas City Chiefs, played through it, finished the game. That says a lot about how tough Dre'Mont really is. But, you know, in a situation like this, I think, yeah, you know, luckily he's not going to have surgery, right? That's a huge thing, right? Because anytime you get hip surgery, you have to deal with scar tissue, and that can affect your mobility at times. But here's why Dre'Mont Jones deserves to be one of the highest paid defensive interior linemen. I mean, obviously in this free agency cycle, I'm not saying he's supposed to be paid more than Aaron Donald. Obviously, Aaron Donald is an anomaly in everything that we talk about here. But for Dre'Mont Jones, I mean, he's been consistent, I'd say, throughout his career. His rookie season, he had 3.5 sacks, right, despite not starting for the Broncos. 2020, he had 6.5 sacks. Last year, he had 5.5 sacks, despite only starting 7 games. This year, he started and he's played. He's been the starter this year. That's where really he emerged as that role. 6.5 sacks, right? But we talk about sacks. Everyone's like, okay, sacks, end all, be all. You want 10 sacks on a season. I think pressures, Sayre, to be honest with you, are very, very valuable when you talk about negotiations, when you talk about like just the overall fortitude of saying, hey, I deserve this. Dre'Mont Jones in 13 games, Sayre, has 16 total pressures. That to me is unbelievable because last year in 16 games, he had 21. So, I mean, he's 5 off with just 3 games remaining. Unfortunately, like he missed last week and he's going to miss the next 3. So hard to imagine, like just say, hey, what if he didn't have the hip injury? I think Dre'Mont is very, very deserving of that opportunity. But I think it also begs the question, how big of a loss is Dre'Mont Jones defensively for Denver with these final 3 games remaining?
I think it's pretty big, right? I think the Broncos have had some guys stepping up on the defensive line. Obviously, you kind of look back at this past weekend against the Arizona Cardinals and say, okay, how did they look without it, right? You got rookies like Matt Henningsen and Eyioma Uwazurike kind of stepping up in his place. I was kind of surprised, Cody. We saw Jonathan Harris went out there and make a play. We saw, DeShawn Williams get 2.5 sacks. We saw, obviously, Mike Purcell continue to play well. DJ Jones getting into the mix with a couple stops in the running game. So we knew going into the season, we felt the Broncos were relatively deep on the defensive line. I think we've seen that come to fruition most of the season. Of course, a couple of games that they haven't pitched shutouts every week against the run. But I think that this defensive line has been pretty well as advertised. So without Dre'Mont Jones out there, it's not to say like long term the Broncos are better off. I don't think that's the case in any manner of speaking, but I do think in the short term I think they can weather the storm. I think they have guys that, hey, with 3 games left, it's a good opportunity for a guy like Eyioma Uwazurike to go out there and get additional snaps. Maybe you see Elijah Garcia promoted for this game against his former team, the Los Angeles Rams, this weekend. So there's options out there to get looks at guys. As we talked about, we're in evaluation mode. Would we like to see Dre'Mont get up to 10 sacks and 25 pressures or QB hits or whatever? Of course we would. But just like we are hoping with Justin Simmons to see him set a career mark in interceptions, that kind of stuff is just kind of icing on the cake of things that we would want to see. But when you're in evaluation mode, you're looking with one eye on the future. Can this guy be part of our rotation next year? Like, can Eyioma Uwazurike, Matt Henningsen, can they be increasing in their role in 2023? We're going to get a chance to see that. So I think the defensive line takes a little bit of a hit here. But as we've seen with Ejiro Evero calling the shots back there, he certainly is not going to let any quarterback just sit comfortably in the pocket. And it doesn't matter what his personnel is, it seems like. Seems like he's maximizing guys, getting pressure one way or the other. And lately, Cody, over the last 3 games, 8 interceptions for the Denver Broncos defense. A lot of that is being caused by the pressure up front. And last week we saw it even without Dre'Mont Jones.
It's a huge thing, and there's various players of the Broncos defense that have been stepping up even further in elevated roles. We're going to highlight some of the underrated Broncos players on defense that haven't been getting talked about enough. You're going to get that on today's episode, Lockdown Broncos. But this episode of the show is brought to you by the Ultimate Football GM, and I'm really geeked out about our new partner and sponsor of today's episode, Lockdown Broncos, the mobile game Ultimate Football GM. Ever dream about becoming an NFL GM and managing your football franchise? Well, your dream could come true, and this game is definitely for you. You get to manage every strategic aspect of your team, play through the season, and lead your team to glory. You're going to be responsible for hiring the right coaches and coordinators, trading players, making draft picks, navigating your franchise through free agency and the draft, and all the ups and downs of a season. All this in a challenging and realistic game world. Ultimate Football GM is completely free and playable offline. Play on the go as you want and when you want to. Lockdown Broncos listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo Locked On in all caps in the game store. That's Locked On in all caps, so make sure you check it out today. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up on the app stores. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. And our good friends over there at Audible. And Audible is releasing a slate of new football podcasts that we're sure that you're absolutely going to love. That's why you'll be able to find episodes from The League available as bonus episodes on Locked On NFL. narrated by Super Bowl champion and legendary smack talker Richard Sherman and sports broadcaster and rising star Taylor Rooks. The League is an 8-part docuseries about the most bizarre, inspirational, and unlikely stories connected to America's favorite sport, pro football. You won't want to miss these untold stories spanning from the 1940s through the present. And our bonus episode is called The Way of the Cowboys and is the incredible story of how the 1977 Dallas Cowboys brought in Bruce Lee's protege to teach their defense martial arts, ushering in a new approach to the way the league trained. Head over to Locked On NFL for a bonus episode of the league or catch the full series wherever you get your podcasts. Available now, Audible. Get in the game. All right, Sayre, continue on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, as we talk about which Broncos players have been stepping up on defense down the stretch. There's been a multitude of guys, right? We talked about Justin Simmons' big-time performance this past week, 2 interceptions against the Cardinals. Several weeks ago, 2 interceptions against the Baltimore Ravens. He's been a bright spot. There's some things we're looking forward to, as you mentioned, a potentially new career high. We know that he surpassed Steve Atwater for all-time career interceptions. That was a cool thing to say. But it lost in everything else, right? We talked about some of the major injuries that Denver's defense has suffered. Dre'Mont being a big one, a big loss for them. Obviously, they traded away Bradley Chubb. Good news is they got Randy Gregory back. They have Baron Browning, Jonathan Cooper. So they're still getting some guys in, Nick Benito getting some run. But in Sunday's game against the Arizona Cardinals, there were several players that stepped up in a big way. And Sayre, since I'm a DB guy, I'm going to highlight Damarri Mathis. I don't think Damarri Mathis has been talked about enough by people in the national media about how well he's played starting opposite a cornerback, Patrick Surtain. There's a lot of people, right? We have these games where we see, like, for example, Jerry Jeudy. People think of the 5-drop game against the LA Chargers. For Damarri Mathis, there were a lot of people like, oh, he gets called for pass interference too much because of one game against the LA Chargers. But I tell you what, Damarri has played really well. He's had a couple opportunities for interceptions. He almost had a crazy interception against the Cardinals. But, man, he has been good, and he had really good coverage on guys like Robbie Anderson and Hollywood Brown in Sunday's game. I'm highlighting Damarri Mathis. I think he's been an absolute stud of a pickup for Broncos GM George Paton.
He has been, and I think we talked about it at the draft. We kind of hoped that maybe we would get the chance to see him be in that nickel role potentially, and now we've got to see him blossoming in that outside corner role with Pat Surtain and then K'Wan Williams on the inside. Cody, I think it's kind of fascinating. We're able to go into an offseason this year kind of knowing who the Broncos' top 3 corners are going to be in 2023. Obviously, there's maybe a bit of a question about Ronald Darby, whether or not he'll be able to come back from that injury or whether or not the Broncos will decide maybe to move on or restructure his deal, keep him as depth. I feel like the guys that are out there right now, Damarri Mathis has proven that he's going to be a starter, in my opinion, for next season and beyond. So I think you find a gem like that in the NFL draft. You can't just stick him back onto the bench. You can't just make him wait for another opportunity because of injury. He's proven he is an NFL starter, and that's been one of the most positive developments of the year for the Denver Broncos. And I think you look up front as well, a couple of guys on the defensive line having big seasons, Cody, a couple of guys that have been, really having to grind out their NFL careers, really grind out for opportunities. Mike Purcell, you remember he played in what was that league that doesn't exist anymore? It was like the AAF or something like that. Yeah, the Salt Lake Stallions. I mean, he went from being on the San Francisco 49ers to then playing in the AAF and just looking for an opportunity in the NFL. He gets it in Denver. I feel like he had that huge year in 2019. He kind of took a step back in 2020, 2021. Injuries happened. Back here in 2022, Cody, I feel like Mike Purcell is having a resurgent year. He's really reminding everybody kind of why the Broncos have stuck with him, kept him around. He's been very good against the run, but also I know these aren't like, crazy numbers or anything, but he does have a career best 1.5 sacks. He does have a career best 3 quarterback hits. Remember, he got the credit for the safety earlier this year. So it's one of those things where Mike Purcell having a big year, but he's not alone on the defensive line either. I think another guy on the Broncos defensive line deserves some kudos for playing an underrated and very important role, especially over the course of this last month.
You mentioned him earlier, right? DeShawn Williams. I mean, for him, I thought he had a really good game, and he's really kind of emerged as a starter at defensive end opposite of Dre'Mont Jones. But obviously with Dre'Mont's injury, I think it gives him, Jonathan Harris, more of a chance to kind of step in and play. And these have been guys that have been, from practice squad, training camp bodies to now starting for the Broncos and having a little bit of a strong impact. That's what you love to see. You know what that is, Sayre? That's player development. And that is something that the Broncos simply have not had. I think when you look at the last 5 years, player development was a really huge emphasis for guys like Vic Fangio, which is why I'd say like a really huge benefit to when Vic was the coach. They really believed in player development. And so far, I don't think we've necessarily seen that from Nathaniel Hackett on the offensive side of the ball, but I'd say like Ejiro Evero comes from the same thinking because who is he coached with? Vic Fangio and company. He's coached with a multitude of really good guys, but DeShawn Williams has played in all 14 games this season. He has a career-best 7 quarterback hits, and he also had 2.5 sacks against the Arizona Cardinals this past Sunday. That was a career high for him. That is a great thing to see. When you talk about guys like stepping up, especially with Dre'Mont Jones' injury, you look to guys to step up. He did just that. I've been blown away by the Broncos' depth, right? Even though that they've been banged up by injury, it just seems like Ejiro Evero's scheme defensively, it doesn't matter who's necessarily missing. Obviously, there's key guys, right? But we saw when Justin Simmons went out at the beginning of the year, Caden Stearns did such a fantastic job filling in. Everyone's like, well, when Justin comes back, do you just move Kareem Jackson into a different role and keep Caden and Justin on the field at the same time? Like, that's what Ejiro Evero's defensive scheme has done. It's allowed guys to thrive. You know, I want to give a tip of the cap to Asang Bassi as well. I thought he's played pretty well in the nickel and also in the dime package as well. He's kind of emerged as that guy for the Broncos. K'Wan Williams has been huge as well. There's just been so many guys playing well on the defensive side of the ball, and I think we have to highlight it. And then I think I'll give a last honorable mention shout-out here. I thought Eyioma Uwazurike, I'm going to start calling him Big Uzi. That's going to be his nickname. I thought he did a really good job. He had a pass deflected at the line of scrimmage early on in the game against the Arizona Cardinals. He had a really couple of good anchor points against James Conner that allowed him to get a couple of tackles for a loss behind the line of scrimmage. You love to see that. I think despite the season being lost there are things like this that make us excited to watch the Broncos play on Sundays. And it's got me excited for Sunday's matchup, Christmas Day, with the Los Angeles Rams. We'll have all the coverage here on the Locked On Broncos podcast. And can the Broncos put coal in the stockings of Baker Mayfield and company? That's a storyline. Obviously, we'll have a crossover episode in tomorrow's episode, Locked On Broncos. But Broncos country, what if I were to tell you that Josey Jewell and Alex Singleton could be the future for the Broncos at the inside linebacker position? We'll tell you why coming up here in just a moment on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. This episode of the show is brought to you by our friends at Total Wine & More. And this holiday, find what you love at Total Wine & More. With so many great bottles to choose from, it's easy to find a new favorite single-barrel bourbon or the perfect gifts for everyone on your list with some help from a friendly guide, and all with the confidence of knowing you found something special for the lowest price. Love what you find only at Total Wine & More. Curbside pickup and delivery available in most areas. Visit TotalWine.com to learn more. Spirits not sold in Virginia and North Carolina. Drink responsibly. Be 21. The Broncos' inside linebacker position has been an area of question for years in the eyes of Broncos country, but a dynamic duo has emerged between Josey Jewell, the outlaw, and Alex Singleton, the piss missile, as we like to call him, at linebacker. These guys have been fun to watch, Sayre, and just want to say thank you so much real quick, Broncos country, for tuning in, making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day, every single day, on your favorite audio podcasting platform, or whether you're watching us on YouTube, you can watch us on your TV, your computer, your smartphone, youtube.com/LockedOnBroncos. We have covered every single day, talking all things orange and blue. I mean, what more needs to be said about this duo here, Sayre, about Josey Jewell, Alex Singleton? Just watching them, they're fun. Like, these guys are so tight-knit. Like, these guys, I'd say, like, them and Justin Sternad, they're attached at the hip. And being able to talk to Josey Jewell in the locker room, Sayre, this guy, I never knew how smart he was when it comes to football, like, in terms of, like, the defense and how he reads and interprets everything. But when you see how he plays and you hear how he talks, you're like, okay, it makes sense. This guy is cerebral. He said it. This is the most fun he's ever had playing in a defensive scheme in the NFL, and he hopes he could play in a scheme like this for the rest of his career.
Well, in terms of intelligence, I mean, we've heard Ejiro Evero say the same thing about Alex Singleton as well. And so you're seeing these two guys play at the highest of levels, and you're seeing them diagnose. You're seeing them be able to come on blitzes. I mean, that was something that we talked about and kind of dreamed about before the season, right? Remember when Josey Jewell went down last season early on with the injury, we were kind of just starting to see him get unlocked as a blitzer. Now we're seeing that a lot more with, I think Alex Singleton blitzes quite a bit more. I was just thinking of that off the top of my head, Cody. I'd need to look up some official numbers on that to find out, but it feels like the Broncos do a great job of kind of interchanging these guys in terms of who's coming and bringing pressure, and it causes havoc for opposing quarterbacks. It really does. I mean, we saw Exhibit A as Patrick Mahomes a couple weeks ago. I know he had a good game on the whole, but really, I mean, 3 interceptions, you don't see him do that very often. So when you're able to force him into those kind of situations, I think the off-ball linebackers don't get enough credit for just how well they are playing. And what's crazy is, remember Josey Jewell, when he was coming out of Iowa, the talk was that, well, he's not fast enough. You know, he's not the typical linebacker in today's NFL. He would have been really good back in the 90s. You know, those kind of things. That's what was said about Josey Jewell. At least those were the things that I remember reading on my timeline, Cody. And yes, I am biased because I'm an Iowa Hawkeyes fan, and I love Josey Jewell. I watched him play every single game that he played from his freshman year all the way to the end of his senior year. And he was the exact same guy at Iowa, but you're talking in terms of 2 different levels here, right? You're talking about a guy at the college level who's like really impressive because, man, he's like a 21-year-old, 22-year-old guy leading this Iowa defense, playing so smart, playing like an NFL veteran out there. Now you're seeing him as an actual NFL veteran, how his game has really evolved through the years. Remember, he was benched back in that 2019 season. He was benched for Alexander Johnson, and people saw that as like this big spark. He's really responded to that well, Cody. I think him and Alex Singleton, especially from my vantage point for Alex Singleton, the way that I kind of perceived that free agent signing in the offseason, I feel like Josey Jewell and Alex Singleton deserve a ton of credit. There's a lot of people, myself included, eating crow about both of these guys in terms of just what they're able to do on the field together. When I say today's NFL, you know, the air quotes, today's NFL, you're asking a lot of off-ball linebackers. You really are, in terms of being able to play all 3 downs. And these guys are doing it very, very well. And so I think, man, Alex Singleton needs a contract after this season. Josey Jewell, he'll have 1 year left on his deal. We'll see what happens, but I think you need to find a way. Alex Singleton's got to be a priority now.
I think he does become that, right? Because not only just his value on defense, but special teams. I mean, Dwayne Stukes is like, selfishly, I wish I could have this guy for all 4 cores. So I have to be very selective. I can have him on this one and this one, but he's got to play defense and things like that. Man, he just flies down the field. He's been, like you said, I think you and I both, we were sitting here on this podcast the moment he was signed. We're like, I just don't know if this moves the needle for the Broncos, right? I'm grateful to actually eat crow on this one. And I tell you what, man, these guys are just having fun. We call them the Smash Brothers. That's what they're doing. Like, they're just having fun out there. They're the fire squad. They're running around with their hair on fire, and they're playing loose. Sayre, have you noticed, too, as well, we haven't heard some of the narratives on Twitter. We haven't heard some of the narratives in the YouTube comments about the Broncos linebackers covering tight ends. It's gone away.
Right.
Because here's the reality of the situation, and I'm glad people are starting to catch on to this. The inside linebackers for the Broncos, they're never going to cover tight ends one-on-one in this defensive scheme. They're always going to have man responsibility on a running back in situations. Outside of that, they're playing a middle hook zone or they're playing a fire zone. They're reading it and they're dropping back. Hence some point why we saw Josey Jewell get 2 interceptions against the Kansas City Chiefs. These guys are having fun, and it's taking the responsibility, having to cover these dynamic tight ends on your linebackers. It's good when you can alleviate that because that's how so many offensive coordinators have taken advantage of teams and of Denver before they had Vic Fangio's scheme prior to that. So we'll see that. And I think there's also another question as well. You know, what does this mean for Jonas Griffith? Sayre, to my understanding, I know the Broncos really, really like Jonas Griffith. Obviously, he suffered the season-ending foot injury. We saw against teams like the Tennessee Titans, you could get creative. You could have all 3. You could have your 3 best linebackers on the field at the same exact time to try to slow down a workhorse that is Derrick Henry. Jonas Griffith, I believe, will return in 2023. If I'm not mistaken, I believe that Denver, it's an exclusive rights free agent designation for Jonas, which I think gives the Broncos the opportunity to bring him. He could be an RFA. It's one of those 2. But the expectation is that he will be back with the Broncos this upcoming season. So, Broncos country, we are eager for your thoughts. Let us know what you've thought about Josey Jewell and Alex Singleton as they've emerged as a very dynamic duo at the inside linebacker position for the Denver Broncos. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you comment your thoughts on that down below. Like the video as well. Or if you're listening on your favorite audio podcasting platform, tweet us on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos. But Broncos country, that'll wrap up today's episode, Locked On Broncos. We appreciate you so much for making us your first listen of the day every single day. Make sure you check out tomorrow's episode of the show as Sayre sits down with the Locked On Rams host to preview Sunday's Christmas Day showdown between the Denver Broncos and the Los Angeles Rams. You get that on tomorrow's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.